You are not alone. Healing Parable. The Parable of the Warm Light. Once upon a time, there was a man named Daniel. Since childhood, he had felt that the world around him was cold and distant. At school, his classmates talked and laughed easily among themselves, but no one truly wanted to be friends with him. His family was always preoccupied with their own affairs, seeming detached and indifferent. His father rarely spoke to him, and his mother was always immersed in work. Daniel grew up and became an adult, but the feeling of loneliness never left him. He found a job, but his colleagues were indifferent. Some were even outright rude, as if the world was a battlefield rather than a place for genuine and heartfelt connections. He tried to make friends, but everywhere he felt the same coldness. People were superficial, self-absorbed, and uninterested in deep relationships. One evening, after an especially difficult day at work, his boss had yelled at him for no reason, and his co-workers had ignored his struggles. Daniel sat on a bench in the city park. He watched the passers-by, but no one noticed him. He felt invisible. A question arose in his mind. Is this how it's meant to be? Will I always be alone? Just then, an old man sat beside him. His face was kind, and his eyes were warm. He looked at Daniel and asked, "You look like you're carrying a heavy burden. Would you like to talk?" At first, Daniel was surprised, but there was something in the man's gaze, something special. He nodded, and the old man continued, "There is a lot of ice in this world. Coldness doesn't come only from winter. It comes from human hearts as well. But do you know that every person has a fire inside them? Sometimes you can't see it, but it's always there. When you find your own fire, the world will begin to change." "How do I find that fire?" Daniel asked. "The fire is what warms you, even when everything around you is cold. It might be love for something you do. It might be animals, who understand the soul of a person. It might be children, who see the world with open hearts. It might be wisdom, passed down from another. When you find these sparks, you'll no longer feel alone." The old man left, and Daniel sat there, deep in thought. The next day, he booked an appointment with a therapist. For the first time, he allowed himself to talk about his pain, about how hard it was to feel invisible in this world. The therapist listened carefully, without interruption, and said, "Loneliness is not a life sentence. It gives you the chance to find true connection instead of settling for a false one. You notice the cold, which means you are searching for warmth. That is already the first step." Daniel left the session feeling, for the first time, that someone understood him. He began observing the world differently. One day, he found a stray kitten trembling from the cold. He took it home, fed it, and for the first time in a long while, felt something change inside him. The small creature pressed itself against him as if saying, "I trust you." A little later, his sister invited him to visit. There, he met his nieces and nephews, who immediately pulled him into their games. They looked at him with excitement, shared their little secrets, and laughed. At that moment, Daniel realized, he was not alone. He mattered. Their world was warm and sincere, and they accepted him without conditions. But one night, he had a strange dream. He stood at the peak of a high mountain, gazing at the vast starry sky. Suddenly, a voice, coming from somewhere above, spoke. "You have never been alone. You have always been part of something greater. You are part of this earth, these stars, this light. You are loved by God, even if you did not know it." Daniel woke up with an overwhelming sense of peace. He had never considered spirituality before, but something inside him had changed. That day he went into the forest and for the first time in his life, felt that he was not just a lonely man among indifferent people, but a part of nature, part of something infinite. He listened to the birds singing, felt the warmth of the sun, and let the wind brush against his face. At that moment, he understood. The world was not cold. It was full of life. From that day on, he started noticing signs. In his conversation with the old man, he realized that their meeting had not been a coincidence. In the eyes of animals, he saw genuine affection. In playing with children, he found true joy. And most importantly, in prayer and simple reflections before sleep, he felt warmth that did not depend on people. Time passed, and the loneliness that once seemed endless began to fade. Not all people were cold. Some were capable of sharing warmth. He found it in the wisdom of the old man, in the conversation with his therapist, in the trust of the kitten, in the laughter of children, and most importantly, in the realization that he had always been loved as part of this world. He no longer sought warmth from indifferent people. Now, he himself had become a source of light. And when he saw others who felt alone, he knew exactly what to tell them. You are not alone. Just look for the sparks, and one day, you will find your warm light. The end.